Imagine dedicating your entire life to your family, raising children, sacrificing dreams, giving everything you had. And then, when you're old, fragile, and need love the most, the very people you lived for turn their backs on you. They mock you, betray you, and leave you to suffer in silence. But what they didn't know was that Grandma Margaret had one last lesson to teach, a lesson wrapped in pain, justice, and the sweetest revenge. If you've ever prayed for karma to give people exactly what they deserve, you're going to feel this story deep in your heart. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with me, because Margaret's journey isn't just about revenge. It's about strength, dignity, and a lesson every family needs to hear. There are some stories that begin not with fire, not with thunder, but with silence. And Margaret's story was one of them. For most of her 72 years, Margaret had lived quietly. A small town, a modest home, a garden full of roses that she cared for like children. She was not rich, she was not famous, but she was kind. And to her, kindness was the greatest wealth a person could own. Her husband, George, had passed away 5 years earlier. They had shared 48 years of life together. A life of simple joys, shared struggles, and endless companionship. The house felt colder without him. The empty chair at the kitchen table was a wound she could never quite close. But Margaret endured. She had her children. Or at least, she thought she did. Her son Richard was busy with his corporate life in the city. He rarely called. His wife, a woman who always looked Margaret up and down as if she were a burden, had made sure their visits became fewer and fewer. Her daughter Clara had once been sweet and close, but over the years, bitterness had settled in her heart. Clara believed her mother had given more love, more attention, to her brother, and though Margaret had tried to explain, to soothe, Clara carried her resentment like a badge of honor. So Margaret found her comfort in her roses. Every morning she would walk barefoot onto the dew-soaked grass, tend to the red, pink, and white blossoms, and whisper to them as though they were listening friends. "They never talk back," she used to say with a smile. "They never betray you. Roses at least remain loyal." But fate, as it often does, was about to test Margaret in ways she never imagined. It started with the letter. A single sheet of paper slipped through her mailbox one rainy afternoon. The words were short, cold, and cruel. Notice of eviction. Failure to meet payments has resulted in the repossession of property. You are required to vacate within 30 days. Margaret froze. She stared at the paper until her eyes blurred with tears. Payments, repossession. This was her home. Paid for decades ago with her husband's sweat and her own sacrifices. How could this be possible? Her hands trembled as she dialed her son. "Richard, something terrible has happened." "I just received an eviction notice." But Richard's voice was dismissive. "Mom, calm down. It's complicated. Just don't worry about it, okay? Clara and I know what's going on." Click. The call ended. Her heart sank deeper than ever. Over the following weeks, Margaret discovered the truth. Her children, her own flesh and blood, had quietly manipulated legal papers, transferring the property under their names while convincing her to sign insurance documents she hadn't fully read. The house she and George had built their lives in, the place where her memories lived, had been stolen by the very people she had loved most. And why? Because the land was valuable. Developers were offering a fortune. Her children wanted the money. Margaret felt her world crumble. How could a mother survive the betrayal of her children? How could she face the reality that the people she had given her life for had turned her into nothing more than an obstacle in their path to wealth? That night, sitting by the window with her roses swaying outside in the storm, Margaret whispered through her tears, "George, if you were here, you'd know what to do. Tell me, my love, how do I fight this?" For days she drowned in despair. Neighbors noticed her quiet figure sitting on the porch, staring into the distance. "She's too old to fight," some said with pity. "She'll have to give in," others muttered. But what they didn't know was this. Margaret's silence was not surrender. It was preparation, because deep inside her fragile body, inside her wrinkled hands and tired eyes, lived a spirit forged in hardship. Margaret had lived through war as a child, through poverty as a young bride, through loss as a widow. And now, though betrayed by her own children, she remembered something her mother once told her long ago. "The most dangerous soul is not the strongest, nor the richest. It's the one who has nothing left to lose." Margaret had nothing left to lose. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke through her curtains, she rose with a calm unlike any other. She put on her oldest coat, tied a scarf around her silver hair, and stepped into her garden. She touched each rose, one by one. "You've kept my secrets all these years. Now, keep one more." Then she went inside and pulled out a box she had kept hidden for decades, an old wooden chest George had left behind. Inside were documents, journals, letters, and savings bonds that no one in the family knew about. George had been wiser than she realized, leaving her with not only memories but weapons. Quiet, powerful weapons of truth and finance. Her eyes hardened as she looked at the papers. For the first time in her life, Margaret was not thinking like a mother. She was thinking like a warrior, and in that moment, Margaret made a vow. "They wanted to take everything from me, but they don't know I will take everything from them, not out of anger, but to teach them the lesson they will never forget." The roses outside swayed gently in the breeze as if bowing in agreement. Margaret's revenge had just begun. Margaret did not run to the courthouse the next morning. She did not shout in the streets or wave the eviction notice like a banner. Instead, she brewed a pot of tea, sat at her old oak table, and spread George's papers before her like a map. There is a peculiar kind of silence that comes before action. Not empty, but full. Heavy but patient. Margaret listened to it. She breathed it in. She began with facts, names, dates, signatures. She read every letter George had written, every invoice tucked into the chest, every savings bond that had matured quietly over the decades. She took notes with a pencil that had been sharpened so frequently, it looked like a prayer stick. Her plan would not be loud. It would be careful. It would be surgical. First, she needed proof. Proof that the signatures on the transfer papers were coerced. Proof that the documents they'd used to claim ownership were built on half-truths, on manipulations. Proof that her children, people who had held her hands through birthday candles and funerals, had conspired in secret. So she placed a call to a woman she barely knew, a paralegal at the town legal aid office, who had once helped Margaret file a small claim against a vendor many years ago. The woman's name was Elaine, and her voice when she answered was warm like old bread. Margaret did not ask for pity. She asked for competence. "Elaine," Margaret said simply, "I need you to read something with your eyes and your heart." Elaine visited that afternoon. She came with a satchel of legal pads and an expression that said she had seen life at its worst and best. As Margaret handed over the papers, she felt something shift, a seed of hope, tender and shy. Elaine's fingers trembled as she flipped through the documents. When she reached the transfer forms, she frowned and asked a single question that would change everything. "Did George sign these?" Margaret's throat tightened. "No, he was gone 2 years when these were signed." Elaine's eyes narrowed. "Then how did they get them? Were you present?" Margaret told her the truth. The vague assurances, the coaxing, the rushed signatures. She told Elaine how Clara had said it was only paperwork, and how Richard had told her it was to protect the house. She watched Elaine's expression change from polite curiosity to quiet outrage. "Margaret," Elaine said softly, "this may be criminal." The word felt like thunder, but it also lit a candle inside Margaret. Next, Margaret did something small and ordinary that felt enormous. She cleaned. She cleaned the attic where boxes of old tax forms lived, where George had kept receipts for a life of honest labor. She polished the ledger where he had recorded payments, the receipts that matched mortgage papers, the stamps that proved dates. Each paper was a stepping stone, each receipt a truth. She sorted them into piles, dates, names, bank transactions, and labeled them in shaky handwriting. The roses outside watched, petals trembling in the wind, as if they too were witnesses. Then she visited the bank. The lobby smelled of coffee and polished floors. The young teller who once joked with her about the weather looked surprised to see her confident, purposeful. She presented the old savings bonds George had tucked away, the account ledgers, the cancelled checks with George's signature. The bank manager, a man with kind eyes and a reputation for integrity, agreed to dig deeper. He called Margaret back 2 days later with a list of transactions that did not add up. "There are transfers," he said, "to accounts that were opened recently. Some are joint, some are personal. We can freeze the suspicious ones pending verification." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She could feel George's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. She whispered, "Thank you." And then quietly, "We're not finished." She also learned the language of leverage. If her children wanted the land for developers, then she would use the thing they craved most: reputation. Margaret was not naive. She knew that shame, once it rusted into public view, could be a powerful corrective. But she also knew the town, and she knew how to wield gentleness and truth like a blade. So she began to tell small stories, to the postman, to the woman at the bakery, to the caretaker at the church. She told them about George's volunteer work, about the youth programs he had supported, about the scholarship fund he'd quietly started in his name. She did it not to gossip, but to place into the town's record a portrait of the couple who had built more than a house. They had built community. People listened. Old friends visited. A neighbor who had not spoken to Clara in years came by and left with a promise to help. A former parishioner at the church offered Margaret use of the hall for a small meeting. The town's quiet interest began to stir. Margaret watched it like a gardener watches a seedling unfurl. Yet Margaret's heart ached as she moved. The betrayal cut deep. She remembered Clara's sharp words, Richard's excuses, the way their eyes avoided hers at family gatherings. There were nights she lay awake and held George's sweater to her face, smelling the laundry soap and the memory of better days. The grief and the grief's twin, righteous anger, lived side by side inside her. She decided early on, her revenge would not be cruel. She would not humiliate her children for the sake of pain. She wanted them to see what they had done, to feel the weight of their choices, and to learn. That to her was the most difficult and necessary part. "If I destroy them," she told no one, "then all I prove is that I can be like them. I will not be like them." So she kept her plan precise. Gather proof, secure assets, and prepare truth. No spectacle, no pomp, just a steady, determined climb toward justice. One evening, as amber light filled the kitchen and the roses outside caught fire in the sun's farewell, Margaret wrote a letter, not to the court, not to the bank, but to her children. It was not an accusation. It was a question. "Do you remember," she wrote, "how you learned to tie your shoes? How we made pancakes on Sundays? How we cheered when Richard made the school team and when Clara painted her first picture? If you have forgotten those things, then tell me why you have forgotten who I am." She did not send the letter yet. Instead, she folded it and placed it in the ledger beside George's receipts. The letter was a reminder to herself, a tether to the person she had been before. Betrayal had sharpened her edges. Outside, a rose petal fell, soft as a sigh. Margaret picked it up and held it between two fingers. In that small, fragile thing, she found resolve. She would be patient. She would be clever. She would teach them, not through cruelty, but through an unyielding mirror of consequence. Her revenge would be slow, like the growth of vines that season after season reclaim a wall. And in the silence that followed, Margaret prepared for the next step. The first real crack in her children's plan came not from Margaret, but from the town itself. It began with whispers. At the bakery, two women leaned over warm loaves of bread, murmuring about how strange it was that Margaret, the widow who had given her life to that house, who had raised her children there, was suddenly being evicted. At the church, the caretaker mentioned the notice he had seen pinned to her door, and at the grocery store an old neighbor shook her head and muttered, "If George were alive, he would never allow this." The whispers traveled faster than Margaret had expected. People remembered George. They remembered his kindness, his quiet generosity, and his laughter that filled the annual summer picnics. Slowly, the town began to feel protective, not of property, but of the woman who had lived among them with dignity. Meanwhile, Clara and Richard were restless. Margaret noticed it in their calls. Clara's voice, sharp and impatient, demanded, "Have you packed your things yet?" She no longer tried to mask the greed in her tone. Richard, on the other hand, grew quieter. His corporate mask was slipping. Margaret could hear guilt in his silence, but guilt was not enough. Not yet. One afternoon, Elaine, the paralegal who had become Margaret's ally, returned with news. She carried a folder, her face pale but determined. "Margaret," she said, "you need to see this." Inside the folder were copies of signatures, financial records, and most damning of all, an internal memo from the developer's office. It detailed negotiations with Clara and Richard, listing them as sole owners of the property. The signatures did not match. The dates overlapped suspiciously with Margaret's hospitalization for pneumonia, a time she could not possibly have signed anything. "They forged more than your trust," Elaine whispered. "They forged the law." Margaret's heart pounded. For a moment she felt both triumph and sorrow. Triumph, because the truth was finally visible. Sorrow, because it was her own children's handwriting staring back at her in lies. That night, Margaret sat by her roses again. The moonlight made them look silver, almost unreal. She touched one bloom and spoke aloud, as if George were listening. "They think they've built a fortress of lies, but all it takes is one truth, steady and patient, to break it apart." The roses swayed gently, like an audience nodding in approval. The next step came quietly. Margaret did not confront her children immediately. Instead, she went to the developer's office. The receptionist, young and distracted, barely looked at her as she said, "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Margaret said softly, "but I have something more important." She placed a sealed envelope on the desk. Inside were photocopies of the forged signatures, the bank transactions, and George's original receipts. The receptionist hesitated, then called the project manager. Within minutes, Margaret was in a glass-walled office overlooking the town she had lived in all her life. The manager, a man in his 40s with an expensive suit and calculating eyes, skimmed through the papers. His expression darkened. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "They belong to me," Margaret replied calmly. "They are my life, my husband's work, my children's betrayal." The manager leaned back. "If this is true, we cannot proceed with the purchase. Fraud would ruin us," Margaret nodded. "Then you know what to do." For the first time, the fortress shook. At home, the phone rang late that night. Clara's voice was shrill. "Mother! What have you done? Do you know how much money you've cost us?" Margaret closed her eyes, breathing deeply before answering. "No, Clara. You cost yourselves. I only opened the curtain." There was silence, then a furious click. Richard called the next day, his voice low and strained. "Mom, you don't understand. We were trying to secure the future. You wouldn't need to worry about anything." Margaret's reply was steady. "I already had a future, Richard. It was the home your father and I built, the life we shared. You tried to erase it for money. That is not security. That is betrayal." Richard's breath trembled on the other end. "I didn't want it to go this far." But Margaret ended the call. Her heart ached, but her resolve grew sharper. The town, too, began to see. When the developer pulled back from the deal, rumors spread quickly. People began to look at Clara and Richard differently. Invitations slowed. Smiles faded. The polite nods they once received turned into stiff silence. Clara fumed. Richard withdrew. Margaret waited. Because she knew the hardest part was still ahead. It wasn't enough to stop the deal. It wasn't enough to expose the fraud. She wanted her children to face themselves, to look in the mirror of their own choices and see the cracks. One Sunday morning, Margaret went to church. The sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting colors over her silver hair. People noticed her presence, quiet but steady, and many approached with warmth. During the service, the pastor spoke of forgiveness, of truth, of the prodigal child who returns after betrayal. Margaret listened, her heart heavy yet hopeful. She did not know if her children would ever repent, but she knew one thing. She would not let bitterness consume her. Revenge for her was never about destruction. It was about revelation, and revelation was already underway. That evening she took out the letter she had written to Clara and Richard, the one about pancakes, shoelaces, and memories. She copied it again, by hand, adding one final line at the end. "The roses bloom because they are cared for, not because they are taken. Remember that." She mailed it. It was not forgiveness. It was not surrender. It was the beginning of the lesson. And in the quiet of her home, surrounded by roses that glowed faintly in the twilight, Margaret whispered, "This is only the beginning." The mirror had cracked. Now it was time for her children to face the shards. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of silence and noise. Silence in Margaret's little home, where the roses bloomed as if untouched by the storm of betrayal. Noise in the town, where whispers about Clara and Richard grew louder each day. For years, the siblings had worn masks. Richard, the successful businessman who spoke in polished sentences. Clara, the devoted daughter with carefully rehearsed smiles. But masks, once cracked, rarely hold. And now, the town had begun to see beneath. It started with the charity board. George had once established a small scholarship for local students. Nothing extravagant, just enough to help a handful of young people pay for books or tuition. The board met twice a year, and though Margaret had stepped back after George's death, her name remained tied to the fund. When the board heard rumors of the forged documents, they grew uneasy. Would people trust a scholarship connected to a family mired in scandal? At the next meeting, Margaret arrived quietly, clutching George's ledger against her chest. The chairman, an elderly man with kind eyes, asked her gently, "Mrs. Wilkins, is it true? Did your own children do this?" The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes looked at her, waiting. Margaret paused, breathing deeply. Then, in a voice soft but unshakable, she said, "Yes, they did. But George and I did not, and his name, his dream, will not be stained by their greed." She opened the ledger showing receipts, notes, and the bonds George had saved. She explained how she was reclaiming what was hers. Not for revenge alone, but to protect the truth of her husband's legacy. By the time she finished, the board members were nodding. Some even clapped quietly. The chairman leaned forward and said, "Then let the record show. The scholarship continues. In Margaret's care." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt George's dream breathe again. But for Clara and Richard, the walls were closing in. At the town cafe, people no longer rushed to greet Clara. She noticed the way conversations halted when she entered. Mothers who once admired her sense of style now avoided her gaze. One even whispered loudly enough for Clara to hear, "Imagine stealing from your own mother. What kind of heart does that take?" Richard, too, felt the sting. At his firm, colleagues who had once envied his confidence now questioned his ethics. An anonymous letter, Margaret suspected it came from Elaine, had reached the office, hinting at fraud in his personal affairs. His boss called him in, cold-faced, and asked, "Is it true?" Richard stammered. He denied, but doubt had already been planted, and in business, doubt spreads like wildfire. Margaret did not need to lift her voice. The truth, once set free, did the speaking for her. Still, her heart remained heavy. She was not celebrating their humiliation. She was grieving the distance between the children she had raised and the adults they had become. Nights were still long, tears still came, but each morning as she tended her roses, she reminded herself, this is not destruction, this is correction. Then came the confrontation. It was a Sunday afternoon. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Margaret was trimming the rose bushes when she heard footsteps crunching on the gravel. She looked up and saw them. Clara and Richard together, faces drawn tight. "Mother," Clara began, her tone sharp but trembling underneath. "Why are you doing this to us?" Margaret straightened, pruning shears still in her hand. She looked at them for a long moment before answering. "I am not doing anything to you. I am simply refusing to let you do this to me." Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched in every line of his face. "You're making us look like criminals." "You made yourselves look like criminals," Margaret interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "I only showed the town what was already there." Clara's eyes filled with tears, though whether from guilt or anger, Margaret could not tell. We just wanted security," Margaret's voice softened. "Security built on betrayal is not security at all. It is a cage, and now you both sit inside it." The silence that followed was heavy. The roses swayed in the wind, as though bearing witness. Finally, Richard whispered, "I never wanted this to go so far." Margaret looked at him steadily. "Then why did you let it?" Neither of them had an answer. When they left, Margaret felt a strange mix of pain and peace. Pain because they were still blind to the depth of their betrayal. Peace because she knew the lesson was working. Every mask they wore was falling away, and soon they would have to face themselves. Later that evening, as rain tapped gently against her windows, Margaret sat at her desk and began to write again, this time not to her children, but to the town newspaper. Her letter was simple, almost poetic. "I am an old woman with roses in my garden and memories in my heart. My children tried to take my home, but what they forgot is this. You cannot steal what is rooted in love, honesty, and time. A house is made of walls. A home is made of truth. And truth, no matter how long you bury it, will always bloom again, like roses in the spring." The editor published it the next morning, and when the townspeople read it, Margaret became not just a victim of betrayal, but a symbol of resilience. People stopped her in the street to thank her for her courage. Young women told her she reminded them of their own grandmothers. One boy, no older than 12, handed her a single red rose, and said shyly, "For your garden." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with both grief and gratitude. Her revenge was no longer just hers. It had become a lesson for the whole town, and as she lay in bed that night, she whispered into the darkness, "George, I think you'd be proud, not because I fought back, but because I chose truth over hate." The rain outside slowed to a gentle hush. Like an answer, by autumn Margaret's roses had grown taller, fuller, as if they too were celebrating her quiet victories. The eviction notice had been torn away, the developers had withdrawn, and the scholarship fund thrived again under her careful hands. But while the town praised her strength, Margaret's heart still carried a wound. Her children. For all her triumphs, she knew revenge alone was not enough. Revenge might protect her home, her dignity, her husband's legacy. But what about the broken bond of blood? Could it ever be healed? Should it? These were the questions that lingered as the leaves began to fall. One chilly afternoon, Margaret received a letter. The handwriting was Richard's. Shaky, uneven. She hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling. Inside were only a few words. "I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know how to fix this. Please, can we talk?" Her eyes blurred with tears. For weeks she had longed for even a crack of remorse. Now it was here, fragile but real. That evening Richard came to her door. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes tired. He looked less like the polished businessman, and more like the boy who once scraped his knees, climbing the apple tree in their yard. "Come in," Margaret said softly. They sat at the kitchen table where she and George had shared thousands of meals. For a long time neither spoke. The silence was not hostile, it was searching. Finally Richard whispered, "I lost everything. My firm doesn't trust me. People look at me differently. And Clara, she blames me for everything." Margaret studied his face. "And what do you blame yourself for?" He swallowed hard. "For forgetting who you are. For forgetting who Dad was. For thinking money mattered more than the home you built for us." A single tear slid down Margaret's cheek. "Do you know what hurt the most, Richard? Not the money, not the house, but that you both looked at me, your mother, as if I were an obstacle instead of the woman who gave you life." Richard lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. "I see it now, and I'm ashamed." Margaret reached across the table, her wrinkled hand resting gently on his. "Shame is only useful if it leads to change. Will you change, Richard?" He nodded, tears brimming. In that moment, Margaret felt the first fragile bloom of reconciliation. Clara, however, was different. When Margaret later invited her to talk, Clara arrived defensive, angry, her pride wrapped around her like armor. "You've ruined my name," she spat. "Do you know what people say about me? I can't even walk into the market without whispers." Margaret listened quietly, letting her daughter's anger pour out. When Clara finally paused, Margaret spoke in a calm, steady voice. "You ruined your own name, Clara. I only told the truth, and truth is like the roses in my garden. No matter how many times you cut them down, they will bloom again. Lies may glitter for a while, but they do not last." Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes wet but unyielding. "Maybe one day you'll forgive me, but I can't forgive you for embarrassing me like this." With that, she stormed out. Margaret stood by the window long after Clara left, watching her roses sway in the wind. Her heart ached, but she whispered, "One day, she will see. Perhaps not now, but one day." As the years turned, Margaret became a quiet figure of strength in the town. Young people visited her garden to hear her stories. Widows found comfort in her words. Even those who had once pitied her now looked at her with admiration. She did not gloat over Clara's downfall or Richard's struggles. She taught others instead. Her lesson was simple. You cannot build a future on betrayal. You cannot trade love for money and expect peace. But if you choose truth, even when it costs you, the world may wound you, yet it will also honor you. On her 75th birthday, the town surprised her with a small celebration in the church hall. Children she had once helped through George's scholarship brought flowers. Neighbors sang. Even Richard stood by her side, humbled, changed, quietly supporting his mother. Clara did not come, but Margaret still saved her a slice of cake. As she blew out the candles, Margaret closed her eyes and thought of George. She imagined him standing beside her, smiling, proud. When she opened her eyes, she whispered into the laughter and music. This was never about revenge. It was about truth. And truth, my love, always wins. That night, back in her little home, Margaret walked barefoot into her garden. The roses glowed faintly under the moonlight. She touched one bloom, soft as memory, and smiled. Her life was not perfect. Her family was not whole, but she had protected what mattered most: her dignity, her home, her husband's dream, and her own unyielding spirit. She had shown her children, her town, and herself the greatest lesson of all: that even in betrayal, even in pain, one can rise with grace. That revenge, when rooted in truth and not cruelty, can become something greater. A lesson that blooms like roses, year after year. Margaret closed her eyes, inhaled the sweet fragrance, and whispered, "George, the roses are safe, and so am I."